In this video, I'm going to show you how I light really big spaces like this gym behind me and turn it from a dingy looking cave to something like this that looks a little bit more polished. When it comes to lighting massive spaces, there are three main things you'll want to consider, but that could look different depending on what you're actually shooting, which is exactly why I challenged myself to hang an entire grid of 1200 Ds. Now, for reference, I've been hired to photograph a competition at my local gym, and if you ever shot in a gym, you'll know that the lighting is usually less than optimal. Typically, you'll find high bay industrial LEDs that have terrible color. And these ones specifically are probably only 40 watts, so they're super dim. And since I'm doing just stills for this project, it's really important that I have a high enough shutter speed so I can freeze the action without any motion blur. I could theoretically just take the easy way out and crank up the ISO, but I know we can do better. Okay, so just for reference, I'm walking around with my meter and just the regular house lights are giving me like 12-foot candles. Obviously not a ton. And they also have these kind of temporary boost mode gym lights here, which are these kind of just LED floods. And so if I meter this, now I'm getting around 80-foot candles, you know, around 8 times more light. But obviously the quality of light is a little bit hard. Color, not great, so hopefully we can just improve the overall ambience. Now, if I was just shooting video with the 800 base ISO and 180-degree shutter, I'd probably be fine. But again, since I'm shooting stills, my goal is to freeze the action, so I need a much faster exposure. And 12-foot candles just ain't cutting it. So the first thing that you'll want to consider when lighting a large area is direction. Now, I've lit this space plenty of times before, but it's usually been in some sort of commercial context, and I'll usually just take the biggest frame I have and send some fixtures through it. But keep in mind that this is a live event, so having a bunch of stands and frames all over the place isn't really an option, and since the athletes are going to be spread out across the entire floor, it would be nearly impossible to light them evenly because of the inverse square law. So that leaves me with one option, and that's overhead. This way, spectators aren't forced to dodge stands, and I also won't have to constantly move fixtures around for different workouts. And to do this, I'm using 9 Aputure 1200Ds on the main floor and 3 600Xs in a secondary workout area. To mount the lights, I'm using what are called junior C-clamps, which are basically these super heavy-duty clamps that have a junior receiver welded to the ends, and in between the clamps are these small pieces of wood called cribbing, which help give more surface area to the clamping force and also protect the surface that you're actually biting to.
How long do you think it's going to take me to light all this?
You gotta feel the music. Feel the...
It's all in the hips, Chubbs.
You jump out of planes easy, you know? Oh! I originally planned on using 600Ds, but it turns out it's a lot easier for me to source 1200s, which admittedly is a bit overkill, but having this many units also brings another huge benefit to overhead lighting, and that's room tone. Now, traditionally, room tone is the 30 seconds of ambient audio that we capture at any location for post-production so that any sound edits are smooth and inaudible, but it actually serves the exact same purpose, but for lighting. It's a base level of ambient exposure that creates a believable atmosphere in the same way that light would just naturally bounce around a room. In most instances, room tone is used as a sort of directionless fill, but in this application, it's actually our key since it's our only source of exposure, and I'm just trying to lift the overall ambience of the event. There's inherently more contrast as you walk towards the edge of the floor, but simply just hanging a bunch of fixtures in the sky isn't enough. And this is where the nuance comes in. Don't mind the background, I'm watching the Oscars. The next thing you have to consider when you're lighting big spaces is shape. This is how we manipulate where and how the light travels, where it falls, where it doesn't fall. Is it soft, is it hard? When you're lighting big spaces from overhead, it's really important to consider why the light is coming from that direction. Are you trying to replicate moonlight with a soft overhead glow, or is the mood more of a hard spotlight coming from above? In this case, we're simply trying to increase our ambient levels on the competition floor. That led me to this, which is essentially a $50 plastic bag, and it's something you see on much larger film sets. This is called a space light because it literally lights a space. It's omnidirectional, so it spreads light over a broad area, and they work best when you have an entire array of them. At this distance, the light appears really soft because it's really large relative to the subject. But once light's actually in position, it very quickly becomes a much harder light source and doesn't end up looking any better than the house lights. That's until you have an entire array of them. They start filling in the cracks, and you start to get this really soft, directionless fill because the light source ends up becoming larger and larger and sort of starts acting as a singular source. Take this incredible scene from Blade Runner. To light it, Roger Deakins used a 300-watt Fresnel, which even at close distances is a pretty hard light, but Roger used 256 of them. They were programmed in a chase pattern, but still appeared soft because of the width of the active units. And the same principle applies when using a bunch of smaller space lights. Deakins often uses this technique because it creates this beautiful volume of light, which is why room tone is so cool. It can be used to emulate a desert wasteland in Vegas or an entire oil field that's caught on fire, or really anything that's on fire. Another one of my favorite examples of beautiful room tone is when DP Eben Bolter used 400 quasars to create large-scale naturalistic moonlight on The Last of Us while still allowing the audience to see what's going on. The main issue was finding a solution for extreme winds in Calgary, so since there are so many individual units, you get that really soft, directionless fill to bring up the natural environment, which is essential whenever you're trying to make your lighting feel as invisible as possible. Early on in my career, understanding shape really helped inform a lot of my lighting decisions, and it dawned on me that the absence of light is just as important as the presence of light. For this project, it would have been really nice to have a teaser to help kill some of that spill on the walls, but given our crew and resources, it turned out just fine. I also want to note that I'm pretty confident that these modifiers are not heat rated for the 1200Es, so the only reason that I was using them was because I only planned on using the fixtures at a maximum output of 40%, so be smart. And if you are interested in getting some space lights for yourself, do yourself a favor and go with the Angler brand. They end up having a much nicer shape than Aputure's version. The skirts are separate if you want to control the spill, but links are down in the description. The Brutalist just won Best Cinematography. So there's one more elephant in the room whenever you're talking about lighting big spaces, and that's power, which has some obvious implications since we're lighting from above with over 9 fixtures. First off, we need to think about how much power we're actually pulling. Obviously, this is pretty location dependent, but one quick and dirty formula I usually use to calculate loads for 120 volts here in America is to take 10% of your total wattage and use that to figure out how many amps you can expect to pull. So a 1200 watt light can pull around 12 amps, or a 300 watt light can pull around 3 amps. Now, it's not exact, and the true amperage will actually be a bit lower, but it does kind of build in some overhead padding so that you're not overloading the circuit and tripping the breaker. Plus, it's really easy math. We're running 1200s up in the ceiling, and I don't plan on running them at max power, just to distribute the load a little bit more evenly. So I only really plan on running them at half power, 50%, because I kind of budgeted for 600 watts all around. So 600 watts times 9 lights should be more than adequate. It'll obviously be easiest to have some sort of power source near the ceiling for a clean run, but if you don't, you'll want to consolidate your lines and then run them along the grid or ceiling with some sort of cable management so that they're not just drooping onto the set. You also want to make sure that your cables are rated properly. If you're using generic extension cables from Walmart, they're probably going to overheat, which is why proper stingers like these ones are a must. These are made from 12.3 SJO cable and have a really nice thick jacket, so they're super durable. I actually made these myself, so if you're interested on a video on how to make them, let me know down in the comments below. I got really lucky since one of the gym owners is an electrician, so we were able to install a gang box up in the rafters. So we had 3 dedicated circuits just for lighting. I ended up running 3 units off of 1 line using a cube tap, so I really only needed 3 stingers to power the entire ceiling. On the day, we ended up getting around 200 foot candles worth of light, which is 16 times more than when we started, which means I was able to lower my ISO from 12,800 all the way down to 800, sort of like going to a low base ISO for stills. but I added a ton of lighting. Another thing we're thinking about is actually how you're going to control all your lights, because breaking out a scissor lift mid-event isn't really an option, but since we're using all Aputure units, I'm just using Sidus Link, which is as far as I desire to go in the world of wireless lighting control. I don't have blackout. I don't want blackout. I want a super easy to use app, which was actually a huge factor into why I chose these units in the first place. Speaking of units, special shout out to Hunter over at Fuego Industries for supplying all of these units for this little project of mine. He's my go-to gaffer here in town and has 5 trucks full of gear. So if you're ever shooting in Vegas and have any G&E needs, Hunter's your guy. There's obviously a million ways to skin a cat, but this is usually a pretty good starting point whenever I'm thinking about lighting big interiors. The overall goal is to just get a decent overall level of ambience, again, which could look different depending on your goals.